Hello, this is Randall Root, and in this video we will look at how to connect to an Azure database and do some ETL processing to an on-premise database. So I'm going to give you some demonstrations here of how to make this work in a couple of simple ways. The first way we're going to look at is using a function called OPENROWSET, and the second way we're going to talk about is using linked servers. Now this is just a demonstration, so be aware there's a few things that I have to comment on. This is not a highly secure demonstration. I'm going to have passwords and logins that are just blatantly obvious. There'll be just text there. But it will give you an understanding of how you can create your own setup. Just be aware that you need to make adjustments for security purposes. Again, we're going to illustrate two different methods of working with this technology, OPENROWSET and linked servers. The first method is we will create transformation views and extract and transform the data before it's loaded directly into the destination table. So we take data from the source, select it, transform it, and load it into the destination tables. The other way of doing it is we're going to extract the data and then put it into a staging table. And then we'll do the transformations in the views and then load it into the destination tables. So similar, but we're adding staging tables for one of the options. And both these will work just fine with Azure Database. We're going to start off with something as simple as I can think of. We're going to have a table that I call students. It has an ID column, first name, last name, and an email column. So very, very simple. In order for you to follow along in this demo, you'd have to create a table in a database up on Azure Cloud. So I'd create a database called Student Enrollments. That's what my kind of goal is for my demo eventually. It'd be up on Azure Cloud, and then in that database, I would go ahead and create a students table with the columns I just mentioned. Now, I want to make the database and then connect to the Azure database either from something like Visual Studio Code or just use the query editor that comes up on Azure Cloud. So if I make this database, student enrollments database, I can go and I can put the code in here to make the table. You can see I've already got that table already, so I don't need to do that. But you need that as part of the setup. You'd want to insert a couple rows of data too. So I've just chosen two simple rows of data to put in the table. And then on your local computer, I'd want to create a destination table. So this is the students table up on the Azure Cloud is the source of our data. And it's going to be poured into the dimensional table called dim students on our local machine. So we're trying to connect data from Azure Cloud into a local on-premise database. So I would make that table. Because this is going to be a dimensional table, I will also include a student key, which is a column, which is our surrogate key column. And I'm going to go ahead and combine the first name and last name into a single name. This is a simple transformation. There's nothing else fancy going on here. We're really more focused on how to move the data from one place to another. Let's first take a look at using the OPENROWSET function. So we're going to use OPENROWSET. We're going to fill up a staging table with the data from the cloud. Then we're going to use ETL view and stored procedures to complete the transformation and loading process. In order to use OPENROWSET on SQL Server, I'll need to do a little bit of configuration first. By default, this function is not available to be ran. It is considered an advanced option, so I need to make a connection to my local machine. And I'm connected to my local machine, localhost. You can see it down here somewhere right there. And then I run that, and that will allow me to see the advanced options. Once I can see the advanced options, I can then go through and turn on the feature Ad Hoc Distributed Queries to 1 for true. force the change by using the reconfigure option. And at that point, I can now go and use my OpenRowSet function to make a connection. So it's probably a good idea for me to check that. The syntax for the OpenRowSet function looks like this. It's like from statement, just like normal. The OpenRowSet becomes the table of results that we're going to get back from a query that we put in here. So I needed to tell it what type of driver or provider I'm using the Microsoft OLEDB SQL provider for this demonstration. There are the other ones out there. I'm using that database I made up on my server up in Azure Cloud. And so I specify the path to that server. You won't be able to use this path because that server will be taken down in just a little bit. But and it's actually only available for my personal IP address, so can't really use it for your own. But you'd want to make your own, and then whatever when you go to the overview here, you'll see a place where you can actually copy the server name, and the server name is what you need to go right in this part here. So that's what I want to put in there. And then after that, it'd be the semicolon. And then after that, it'd be the user ID and the password that you would make up. And then, of course, the name of the database. Followed by that, I'm going to select all the data from the students table. And I have a table alias right here. So I can just say select all from the OpenRowSet. In reality, I'd probably go ahead and enumerate the columns, list out the columns itself. But for this simple demo, we just want to check to make sure this thing works, and then we get some data back. So yeah, that data is coming back from Azure, so we're in good shape. We can move on to the next part. So now we can start the process of loading the data into the staging table. And my staging table is going to be on my own local machine, so I'm connected to my local machine. I'm not connected to the Azure database, data server. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I kind of clear the table out because I was practicing this demo before I started making the video. And then I'm going to go ahead and create my little table. So this is the staging table, and the staging table will match my cloud table directly. I want it to be an exact match for it, so I can just pour the data directly from the clouds table and into my local table. And that's typically what we do. We usually don't do a lot of transformations. We bring in the raw data. We do the transformations later. So we load the staging table first, then we transform it, and then we will then take the transform data and load it into the actual destination table. So a little bit different process than extract, transform, and load. We're actually extracting, loading, transforming, and loading. But it's still an ETL process. Some people refer to it as ELT process, but at the end of the day, it's still using those same action items of extract, transform, and load. So that's what we're talking about here. Anyway, so I've got my staging table, and now I'm going to insert the data that I get from this select statement. So this is the select statement we saw before. And I use an insert into statement to insert that data into those columns. Notice that in this case, I am enumerating the column names. It's always a good idea to do that when you're doing an insert. Well, you can sometimes get away with it. A lot of students seem to have problems when they try to just kind of save a little typing and they don't get this enumerated correctly. They will try to do it by default, but doesn't always get it right. So you should always try to do that and just avoid the hassle. It's not that much extra typing. And as you can see, when I run it, in no time at all, the data is loaded into my staging table, and then I can start doing my transformations. The best way I know to do transformations is to create a transformation view. In this case, you'll have the code that does transformations, such as simply doing things like concatenation or maybe data conversions, or even just something as simple as putting aliases on things to make it more apparent what we're trying to load from the source table, in this case our staging table, and into which columns we're dealing with. So I'd make that transformation view, and then after the view is made, I'd make a stored procedure to actually do the ETL insert into the into my staging table. So this would be doing a loading process of the data from my staging table into the destination table by referencing the view, because the view does my transformation. So I'm selecting the data from the view, which transforms it and then inserts it into the staging table, which is my load process. So now all I have to do is, let me clear out that table, make sure it's all nice and empty. I run my stored procedure. The stored procedure runs. It uses the views for the transformations. And when we look at the content, we can see that the first name and last name have indeed been combined. And we filled up our dimensional students table. So that's one way to do it. It's a nice, clean, simple way to go. But there is another option you can use that you may see out there in the industry. It's called a link server. Link servers are something that is a semi-permanent connection. You can set it up and then you can delete it later on if you want. But the idea of a link server is it's always available for you to query. Where the OpenRowSet, you have to do it on a individual by individual basis. So you'd have to make the OpenRowSet for each table that you want to fill up. If you want to fill up 10 tables, you'd have to use OpenRowSet, the code for OpenRowSet 10 times. Not a big hassle, it's just something to be aware of. With the link server, you set it up once. Well, I'll go ahead and I'll make sure that it's dropped right now before I continue. And then I'll go ahead and set it up like this. I will add a link server to my local installation of SQL Server. I'll just give it a name for my remote server. I'm going to call it Azure Link Server. You can just make up a name. I'm going to use this provider, the same provider we used in the OpenRowSet. This allows us to, this is like a driver. It allows us to do a translation from the way Azure communicates and the way my local SQL Server installation can communicate. I'll point to that server I had on the cloud and the database I'm using. In addition to that, I also want to set up my security context, so I'll put in the name and password. Once again, you would not use this name and password. You know, if for this demo it works just fine, but you'd want to change it to your own login and password and stuff. There's nothing up there. You're going to, that's secure, but I do have to make that point because people are notoriously bad about taking demonstrations and then trying to use it in production and only finding out later on that that was a bad move on their part. So once I've done that, what happens is that my SQL installation now will have a link server, and I can see it in Management Studio. I can see my Azure link server here. It's configured. It doesn't show up over here in my tree view for my server. Actually, maybe it does. Okay, excellent. Okay, yep. I had forgotten that included that. Nice. So you can see I've got the Azure link server there. This is the one I was messing with earlier. And now I can just go ahead and select data from that as well. So if I say select all from the table, I can see into that table up on the cloud through my link server. And there we go. So that's coming in from the cloud. So let's verify we can read the data before we continue. Okay, so now we can see that we can pull the data in. I'm just going to go ahead and clear that staging table out. And in this case, I'll just use my link server to fill up the staging table. So I'm still filling up the staging table. I just use the link server to do it instead of using OpenRowSet. Now, the advantage of this is that, as you can see, the syntax is a little bit easier. And to tell you the truth, the link server it's kind of sitting there waiting to be used, so it's more convenient but it can have some additional network overhead, I guess, as it kind of keeps track of its connection. I've read that, but I haven't actually ever verified that that was true. Still, I do know that just having an open connection readily available is considered an additional security risk, just instead of because I'm connecting to a remote machine. However, you can't argue the fact that it's very convenient. So for any table that I want to refer to up on that server, I can just use this 4-part name, the name of the server, link server, the name of the database, the schema, and the object, and I can just pull that data right into my staging tables. Then once that's in the staging table, we can do the same thing we did before, truncate the table to clear out the dimension table, and use the stored procedure to fill it up again. Stored procedure calls the view, and then at that point the view does the transformations, and then the stored procedure loads the data, and now we have the same data as we had previously with the first name and last name combined. Another way you could do this is you could just skip over the staging table. The staging table is not strictly necessary when you use a link server. So it's possible just to go ahead and skip over that. You can't just skip over it when you're using OpenRowSet. And the reason for that is the way I'm going to skip over the staging table, just drop it, is I'm going to make a call. I'm going to select the data from the cloud table directly in my view. So I'm calling it through, I'm selecting against it through the view using the link server. Now, if I tried to do this with the OpenRowSet in the from clause, I'd have to have OpenRowSet. And OpenRowSet is not a command I can use inside of a SQL view. So that being the case, I can't do that I can't get rid of the staging table if I'm using OpenRowSet. Not a big deal, but it's just something to be aware of. So my ETL view has been modified. I've modified it to not select from the staging table. I've modified it to select directly from the cloud table using my link server. This is a minor adjustment, but it does the same thing as before. I'll clear out the table. I'll execute the stored procedure, and then I can see the the students table has been filled up with my data. Now, after I'm all done, I probably should get rid of some of these objects. I don't necessarily need the student staging table. I'm not using anymore. Don't need the view. Don't need the stored procedure. And it's usually a good idea not to leave these open connections available for security purposes on your machine. Now, on your personal machine, it may not be as important, but certainly in the workplace, it's very important. So if you're not using something, especially something that connects to another machine across the internet or across a network for that matter, it's often a good idea to just turn it off. I can do that by just turning off the OpenRowSet option by changing this to Ad Hoc Distributed Queries from 1 to 0, which means false. And I can drop the link server, and that'll be gone at that point. So to clean up those. So if I just run this, it kind of resets everything, and we go back to where we were before. So anyway, just some notes, some things that to think about. I'm not using staging tables will not work with OpenRowSet, as I'd mentioned, since you can't have OpenRowSet in your ETL view. Using a staging table does add the extra step in the ETL process, but it can provide you a little bit more control over working with data. That can allow you to do some validation before you even start trying to run it through your transformation process, which is handy. I've noticed that sometimes, especially if you're working with a file system, when you want to get data from a file, the file can't react to working with SQL code directly. But you can take the data from a file, dump it into a staging table really quickly using whatever language you want, including SQL, such as using the bulk insert command. And then once it's in the staging table, you can still use the same ETL views that that we just saw and the stored procedures that we just saw. So the only thing that changes in that case, if you move to a file-based system, is that you once again will be kind of restricted because you can't use a tool like the bulk insert, SQL's bulk insert command inside of a view. So you just use a staging table. So staging tables are a nice feature. It's not a must-have feature, but it's nice. It gives you a little bit more control. On the job, the choice totally depends on your requirements. So the security consideration, performance needs, etc. In the course that you're taking with me, you can choose either one, whatever makes sense to you. The staging tables are a great way to give you a little bit more control over the process. Oh, looks like I have a redundancy in here. But I will accept either. So whichever way you do it, it's fine with me. Links service do simplify things by eliminating need for the staging tables, but there may be some performance issues when you try to do the transformation against a large amount of data. Typically, if you take the data from the cloud or from files or wherever and you dump it in the staging table as raw data, that process goes really quick. It's only when you start applying transformations that things start to slow down. And if you have a local staging table that's directly available to the dimension tables, then the transformation goes really quickly because you're using the same you're using the same context of that database to work within. And this is usually the fastest way to work with large ETL processing. So a good reason to kind of include the staging tables when possible, even if it's easier to use the link server directly. Anyway, in real life, always consider the best security practices, such as making sure you don't put sensitive information in a demo or in the production code. So obviously don't put the name and password directly in there. If you do, if you have to put something in there, and sometimes you do because you need to have something to connect to a remote server, make sure that you secure your code and lock things up and use all the techniques necessary to keep people from abusing the code that you've created. But anyway, hopefully that gives you an idea of how you can set up a link server and use OpenRowSet to create a simple ETL process. Thanks for watching.